All right, we're gonna just give a quick welcome to everybody who's joining. We're not gonna start just yet, and we will shortly. But if you, um, I wanted to kind of orient people first to that. There's the chat where we would love for you to tell us who you are, where you're tuning in from. There's also a Q&A, and the Q&A is where if you have any questions throughout this webinar, you can pop them into there, and at the end, we will go through and answer those. So. We'll just give it another minute and then we'll get started. All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're excited to have you here. My name is Melody Joy Payne. I am a photographer, filmmaker, and podcaster. At the heart of all of that is storytelling. And I have a production company called Imperfect Joy, and I run a rare disease awareness campaign called Rare Rebels. So, over the next hour, we'll be diving into how patient-centered design transforms trial accessibility, exploring key insights and practical takeaways. Before we start, I want to note that we'll be running the Q&A session after the discussion, as I said. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat as we go or in that Q&A box. All right, I'd like to introduce our panel. So starting with Amanda, can you please tell us briefly who you are and how you connect to this conversation?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Melody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Amanda Decoker. I'm head of the patient recruitment and retention team within Takeda. So again, this is near and dear to my heart in terms of what I do. I've now been with Takeda for 6 years, in the industry for 18, working at a number of agencies prior to this. And in addition to my responsibilities for all things patient recruitment and retention, we've also recently taken on all patient activity for our patient engagement initiatives. Very important to ensure that the voice of the patient is all that we do, as well as working very closely with our trial equity team. So again, so excited to be part of the panel today.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, Nicole.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Richie. I'm the Global Head and Vice President of Population Science, and I lead our Advancing Inclusive Research work, which is focused on ensuring we have representative patient populations included in every aspect of our discovery, research, and development in order to ensure our medicines optimally work across all patients in the world, and we reach all patients with our science and medicine. Really excited to be here with you today.
Thank you. And Ryan.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to the panel. My name is Ryan Kilpatrick. I am the head of global epidemiology at AbbVie. I'm an epidemiologist by training. I'm a pharmacoepidemiologist by practice. I lead a team here of epidemiologists, outcomes research scientists, analysts. We do work, obviously, in thinking about both real-world evidence as well as how we help to support inclusivity in trial design, although I will say I'm not speaking on behalf of AbbVie, and there are a lot of people in the company that are leading, working, and thinking about this issue and are working on initiatives related to this topic. So I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm speaking only to my own 20 years in biopharma and my role, my current role at AbbVie. So thanks so much for having me.
All right. I love that we have such a unique mixture of people in the clinical trial space here on the panel. And we also, before we got started, talked about how, racially, we're not representing the inclusivity that we're talking about. Can you just, Nicole, I know that you kind of brought this to our attention. Can you speak to that for a second?
Certainly, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are numerous people I'm representing on my own team, but also in other teams in the organization. And I think it's important to have representation at all levels. And we also think about diversity as a multifaceted construct, including, yes, race, ethnicity, genetic ancestry, sex, gender, and other dimensions. So I think it's important that we acknowledge these things and that we are aware that this panel does not represent the racial and ethnic diversity that we're talking about today, and that it's important that we all have partnerships with others within our organizations and beyond that have different lived experiences so that we accurately can reflect those in this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So there's obviously like socioeconomic and cultural barriers are often talked about when we discuss inclusivity. Ryan, what other types of diversity do we look at when we're talking about this subject?
Yeah. So, I will say again, don't obviously not representing all of the different diverse aspects of patients who we are trying to include in our not just in our trials, but I think I like to think about this as widening it to, the evidence that we need and collect that informs, benefit risk and also ensures that we are supporting basically the public health, right? So epidemiology is a public health science. It's really a science focused on understanding how treatments, how diseases are distributed throughout the population and ensuring that we've characterized the diversity of patients in the broader populations that we are seeking to support, to improve the lives of, to impart, new health interventions. So it's sort of table stakes for how, epidemiologists would think about inclusivity. And I will say, I mean, there's so many dimensions to Nicole's point. I mean, there's so many dimensions. So I think, this is, in my view, this is about how we generate, very as meaningful evidence as possible during our trial phase. But then, what my team and what I think about as well is how do we continue to build out that understanding of evidence across the multitude of patients in the real world that are going to reflect a much more heterogeneous population. Because even as great of a job as we can do in a trial is going to still be limited by its size, by its duration. So when we see things in the real world, there's obviously all kinds of people and all kinds of physician practices and people living in community settings and people living in urban settings. And, I think really our evidence and our understanding of how drugs are used and their benefits and risks is just needs to continually evolve actively, even after a product is brought to market. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I mean, there's so many dimensions. I think the last thing I'll say is, we certainly will continue to focus on targeted collection of data on patient populations where we think there may be differential effects or particular issues with regards to safety, tolerability, utilization, practice patterns, et cetera. So I think it is, as I mentioned, a continual and active process of evidence collection and evidence generation.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think I was also imagining how within different patient populations, there's diversity that we might not know about without having talked to the patients first, right? Like there might be patients who have extreme dystonia and some patients who have no dystonia within a certain diagnosis. And we might not know those things until we talk to the patients. So, Amanda, could you talk a little bit about when we include patients in this process?
Absolutely. The reality of when we include patients in this process is from the onset. And we need to contemplate this not only in the onset, but across the entire clinical trial continuum. So when we think about the clinical trial continuum today, and I know, Nicole, you spoke about this in some of your focus and discovery, but it really does span from discovery, preclinical development, early clinical development, and then, to your point, Ryan, the regulatory approval process and post-marketing. So we need to ensure that we are looking at how best to incorporate the patient voice in each phase of that journey. And as an example, if we think about as early on in discovery, there are so many different reasons why we want to engage with the patients. First and foremost, we need to enhance our understanding of the disease and conditions. And ways in which we can do this is engaging with patients to provide insights on that patient journey. The differentiation in terms of that patient journey really fits as we are speaking to around the inclusivity and truly that diversity that we know exists today. And we need to be able to understand what that is and how best to address it. Also, the reality of sharing unmet medical needs. And again, when we're thinking about appropriate representation in our clinical trials, we need to understand these very foundational components so that, again, we can meet the needs of this broader patient population. Some of the additional areas of focus around bringing that patient voice in within the clinical development life cycle, looking to such things as preclinical development, thinking about how we can receive input into our study design or our study burden as a whole. That's going to be critically important if we think about how best to meet the needs of our patients, but also something as practical as feedback on our clinical outcome assessments or elements to the like. And as I mentioned, my team focuses very heavily on the early clinical development and clinical development within Takeda, patient recruitment and retention. So really thinking about how we're meeting those needs. So I also will focus on this before concluding this in terms of how we engage our patients to consult on study-specific assessments and frequency, patient-facing materials, informed consent forms, outcome measures, study endpoints, all so basic, but until we ensure that it is truly meeting the needs of our patients, we are not doing our job within the industry. And then lastly, in clinical development, just ensuring that we, again, are infusing the voice of our patient in how we're developing our recruitment strategies and tools, how we're providing feedback on the barriers that we know will exist, so that at the end of the day, we are developing a fit-for-purpose strategy, fit-for-purpose solution that are meeting the needs of our patients, in addition to the clinical profiles that we're looking to develop and uncover. So again, just really speaking about that end-to-end process, but speaking very specifically around the clinical development phases, which is where my team is focusing most dominantly throughout that cycle.
So you used the word infusing patient voices, which I love, and I want you to tell me a little bit more about what that looks like in practice.
Absolutely. So there are so many different methodologies that we can tap into around this. So there are the most basic of methodologies around obviously patient interviews and panels and focus groups. But I'm very excited to share two very specific examples that we've launched within Takeda. One being our WeConnect platform. So this is a platform that we launched about 2 years ago at this point. And what it is most basically is Takeda's clinical trial patient and HCP, or healthcare professional registration platform. And what we know to be some of the greatest challenges when we think about recruiting patients for clinical trials, it really boils down to lack of awareness, lack of trust, and lack of access. So what we're really trying to do with this platform are address those primary gaps around building education in terms of their ability to understand the latest clinical trial information and empowerment. Empowerment is a key piece of the puzzle. So when you think about much of what is available today, educational content, yes, but if it doesn't then empower that patient to take the next step, it really is falling short. So the WeConnect platform is one that we launched that really bridges that gap in terms of being able to provide that clinical trial education, that access to our active portfolio of clinical trials, and that empowerment on how they take that next step. Another real world example, and as we think about ensuring that we are going to the patient rather than the patient to us, is a phenomenal initiative that our trial equity team has launched, which is our communities as partners. So this is where we have a number of community events that can be around health fairs or music festivals or faith-based events, just as an example, where we are now coming into the community. It is important that we have a face. It's important that we're able to engage directly with our patients. So that has been a phenomenal opportunity for us to have those face-to-face conversations, really having WeConnect as that digital foundation that we can drive in terms of that next step. But again, just one way that not only do we have to have the foundational components, but we need to be active, we need to be present, we need to show up. So those are two real world examples that we have deployed most recently to really try to close that gap. Melody, I apologize. You actually have gone on mute.
I'm on mute, thank you. I know that all of you are, like, your companies have a focus in rare disease, I believe, right? Can anybody speak to how rare disease has created kind of a model of patient engagement and patient involvement in these clinical trials that we can also bring to other disease states? Is that something any of you have come across?
So more than happy to begin and then open it to my fellow panelists. So you're absolutely right. We have a significant focus within our pipeline on rare disease, and that brings about unique nuances that we have to address. And to your point around patient engagement is critical for many of the reasons that I said before, but particularly in rare disease because of those nuances of disease. First and foremost, diagnostic journey, progression, access to care, et cetera. So this is where we spend quite a bit of time with much of the methodologies that I've noted before, but also another key component that we ensure that we incorporate in any of our strategies for rare disease is collaboration with our patient advocacy groups. A critical component in terms of being able to connect to very trusted communities, to be able to learn directly from them what are their unmet needs, what are their greatest challenges, barriers, and then how can we as an organization address that. So again, just one particular component that we deploy very heavily in the rare disease space and being able to tap into those patient advocacy groups as well.
And Ryan, have you had crossover with rare disease at AbbVie?
Yeah, I mean, not at AbbVie, yes, and then also in prior roles that I've had across biopharmaceutical. I mean, I think all points well made. I think that rare disease tends to be generally well mobilized by patient groups, and I think what there are some opportunities and challenges there, right? The opportunities are there's usually a lot of incentive to participate in some form of science to enable breakthroughs. So that's great. And I think, mobilizing a patient community is an amazing way to garner, enthusiasm and excitement about, what can be done. I think to points earlier made, perhaps outside of that setting, it is, I mean, at the end of the day, right, we're trying to add value to patients. We serve patients. So what's important to patients in terms of outcomes, endpoints, impact, I think, it's important to keep our eye on that. And I think sometimes, right, especially probably in broader chronic disease conditions, it's easy to fall back into what is sort of been used traditionally as regulatory acceptable sort of endpoints and outcomes. And I think although those are often important because they're validated, they're usually very quantitative. I think at the end of the day, right, when we really look at what patients see as life-changing, life-enhancing, life-improving, we need to Amanda's point, make sure that we're capturing that critical evidence as early as possible, both to support the value, but also to support potential differentiation of one product versus another. It may be that one product may look similar when it comes to some of the traditional clinical trial endpoints, but it may actually offer unique advantages when it comes to things that patients may care about. It could be tolerability, for instance. Tolerability, something like nausea and vomiting might not seem as big of a deal when you're talking about a debilitating chronic disease, but it may actually really impact patients' ability to carry out their daily activities and feel good. And so, I think those elements are really important. I think we across industry always can do a better job of making sure that we're designing our trials not only with the regulatory approval in mind, but also making sure that we're really embedding throughout the entire life cycle, as you said, embedding our understanding of patient utilities within our experimental programs, and then, of course, also within our broader evidence generation activities. And I think AbbVie does a very good job of that. I think it's always something that we should continually improve. And the last thing I'll say is, we're all generally patients. I mean, I think it's really interesting to think about, us as sort of, we think about patients and we think about, us as scientists or us as, but there really is no clear barrier between, patients and us, right? Many of us are patients, or our loved ones are patients. We're human beings. We're part of a larger, public health ecosystem. And so, I think having that empathy and thinking about, what would I, how would I communicate this to a loved one, or what would I decide? How would I make a decision or a choice? I always try to bring myself back to that, to the human factor, and less of the us versus a patient, and more of really, it's a human experience, right? It's all a common shared human experience that we all go through, whether young or old, right? So, yeah.
Oh, I love that you brought in that point. Thank you. And we've been kind of talking a bit about collaboration here. And so, Nicole, I'd love to bring you in to talk a little bit about the research site alliance that you have. How does that tie into collaboration or, patient engagement, as we've been talking about?
Yeah, of course. And just building on that fantastic point that Ryan ended with in saying, we develop products as a pharma organization. We're developing medicines for patients are customers, right? And it would be unheard of in any other setting that we wouldn't listen to our customers and what the customers' needs are. So I always think it's almost comical that we have to justify that patient voices should be completely part of everything we're doing in drug development. I know I'm seeing Amanda and Ryan nodding. I think that's probably resonant with many of us who do this work and who just know that it is a matter of business imperative that we include patients across all of the considerations and elements of drug development and research. So moving into the inclusive research site alliances, one of the initiatives that we started early on, and it seems incredibly intuitive to do, but it's a partnership model that is actually it was first in its kind when we started it, that we instituted to support our ability to transform outreach for understudied and underrepresented patient populations in clinical research. We reached into the investigator community with sites who have historic precedent in reaching communities of color in particular, and have strong community partnerships. Because another aspect of patient outreach is that pharma isn't necessarily the right partner. Sometimes a community partner is the better integrator of that relationship. To be quite frank, pharma isn't trusted in a lot of ways as an industry. So I think facilitating partnerships that already exist within the healthcare ecosystem is really critical. And we can serve as a convener, we can play other roles in that space, but really making sure the connection between provider and patient is what we're supporting, that will help us bring this trust element. There's health literacy, there's all of these different factors that are related to how we can best reach patients. And so we've set up this model across our portfolio in numerous therapeutic areas. We started in oncology and ophthalmology, and that's where the richness of the portfolio was at the time. And we found that our sites that we selected in this model reach patients of color 2 times faster than any other sites that we typically work with. And in oncology, they recruit 81% more, have 81% more diverse enrollment than their peers in any given study. So it just goes to show that if you reach into the community, into different health sectors, that you can partner in ways that will truly transform our ability to reach historically understudied populations. And something also that Amanda said earlier, in addition to, enrollment of patients is a foundational aspect of what we do, but it's really the insights we gather through these relationships, which is really the patients to the provider, that helps us redesign how we think how we approach our studies. It helps us embed these important and seemingly intuitive aspects into our development process. One example is in inclusion-exclusion criteria. In oncology, studies are very rigorously defined, and there's reasons for that, but sometimes they're overly stringent in how we make sure that we are protecting our ability to see a signal. We saw in one of our breast cancer studies that we were disproportionately screen failing or excluding Black women in this breast cancer study in one of our site alliance sites. And we found out that it was because of an A1C requirement that was screening out pre-diabetic patients. Some comorbidities are more common in certain patient populations as well. So it gave us a really tangible insight into something we could potentially address as part of our study design that otherwise we might not have noticed. And so having those partnerships with key physicians, investigators that are already treating patients that we historically haven't included in research gives us that ability to not only include them in studies, but change our design at the outset.
That's awesome. So you had mentioned in there about, the lack of trust in pharma is often one of the big barriers. What other ways, like potentially if a pharma company says, well, we're trusted, people know us and they respect us, right? Why then still partner with a community site instead of doing this on their own?
I think that trust is a broad topic. When you talk about trust in this particular setting, and you're talking about patients of color, there have been historic atrocities that very much cause a distrust, not just with pharma, but with medical institutions in general. Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee experiments, there's numerous very, very important historic atrocities that have taken place. And there are numerous safeguards that have been put in place to prevent such things from happening in the future. However, memories are long, and we can't just assume that those things are not attributable to some of the elements that we see in the challenges of reaching patients. So I think that there is truly something to be said as well about the representation at the center level, and making sure that that our community partners are trusted members of those communities. Um, we've also put in place an advisory council we call our external council, that is a collection of physicians and patient advocates who again have historic experience in health outreach, health equity, in reaching patient populations across different segments. And we partner with them very closely because they help us validate our thinking and define what we're trying to achieve. I think if we had all the answers inside our own walls, we wouldn't have this challenge. There's there's a lot of thinking that, we can answer anything if we have the right expertise, but that's simply not true in this case. We have to really look outside of our own expertise and partner into the healthcare ecosystems, or we'll never solve these big challenging problems.
Mm. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm from many community partners to work together hand in hand, but I imagine there must be times when it's more challenging. Amanda, have you ever come across difficulties in that space?
Yes, I have most basically. And another point that I can build on from what Nicole had said, and this has really allowed for some of those challenges. If we think historically how we as pharma industry have engaged with community partners, as an example, or with particular institutions or physicians, et cetera, it's been in a very transactional manner. And again, this is not something that any of us have wanted to do. This has been the reality of how we've needed to operationalize based upon constructs of organizations, individual teams, et cetera. But what that then presents, Melody, is a challenge in the sense that when we want to really break down these walls, break down these barriers, build this trust, it can't be in a moment in time. It has to be something that is established over a period of time that showcases our commitment, our dedication. So what we've really attempted to do on our end then is to flip that dialogue a bit and to address that challenge by really not thinking about it in that moment of time when I need to work with a particular institution, physician, or patient, but really start from day one and really begin to build that comfort, as I mentioned before, around the relationship, build that awareness. And this is where going back to some of those comments I had made before around our WeConnect platform or communities as partners. Before we can start talking about clinical research in terms of particular protocols, we need to start with what is clinical research? How does this potentially benefit? What are the risks? What are the pros and cons, et cetera? So really building that foundational relationship, building that foundational knowledge, and then again, obviously evolving that into what could be a potential opportunity, such as a clinical research study. But again, one of the top challenges, Melody, is really being perceived as being very transactional in nature. And how we've been working to address that is beginning these relationships much earlier on and understanding that it's not a moment in time, but a commitment that we now make to this community that we now need to ensure that we are delivering upon for the long term.
I love how you said day one. And one of the things that we've been talking a lot about, especially in rare disease, is how there's actually trust built before you even have interest in a specific diagnostic community. So showing up for the rare disease community as a whole for patients and being there before you have an interest in, before you have a profit motive, essentially, is something that is really important to that community in particular. So are there ways that any of you have kind of at day zero focused on building that trust even before you've announced that you're working in a space?
So I know we've done that considerably, obviously, through the Communities as Partners program. But Melody, as we speak about specific patient populations, rare disease or other, really identifying those trusted partners in this space. And I commented before around patient advocacy. So something we'll commonly do is really identify those key advocacy partners or community-based organizations and really begin that dialogue very early on so that they understand before we have a clinical trial in our pipeline. But again, understanding our interest to really invest within this community, to be a partner, to really work in a collaborative manner so that when we do have that potential for clinical research, that we're also bringing that voice in from day one, that they are developing in partnership with us. And that has made very meaningful strides with us. And like I said, primarily that's been working through patient advocacy groups or community-based organizations very early on before we had that specific clinical trial for presentation for consideration.
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on that, I think, I mean, that's obviously critical because if we're trying to understand unmet needs, it has to start with deeply connecting into the patient community, regardless of any sort of treatment. When you're thinking about, I mean, large, small organizations, right? You're trying to address something that is not currently addressed with standard of care. So it's absolutely critical that you start by understanding what is the unmet need. Otherwise, to the point about looking at the customer first, right? You have to take a design thinking approach. What are we trying to solve for? I've never fortunately worked for a company that's interested in Me Too types of approaches where it's just, let's just double down on something that's not transformative for patients. So if you want to transform something, you have to start with what are you solving for? So, I mean, I know that we do that across, multiple of our disease areas, right? We're thinking about that with obesity now. We've been thinking about that with our CF patients. We've been thinking about that with our migraine patients. Obviously, for a very long time in immunology where we're deeply connected. We do that through registry partnerships. We do that through, directly through other, many other channels and means to collect and really understand that information. So I think it's really the only way to be successful. And I will say, I think, given what we see in terms of, external pressure and headwinds, I think that there's only going to be more of a need for life sciences companies to double down on what's adding value for patients because value is the word of the day, right? If we're not doing something that's going to add significant and really in many ways transformative value, it's just not going to fit into any new future model for life sciences companies. So yeah, I mean, a critical point, a critical discussion, and I think I still think there's opportunity generally across the industry to even, go more deeply into characterizing the disease state by way of more disease registries. I think to your point about rare disease, not all the time, but a lot of times there is more cohesiveness around, unified around a specific rare disease. Not always, but I think when you look more broadly, there's maybe less of a singular focus, right, on unifying patients in some sort of a disease state registry to really deeply collect that information from patients. And I think there's huge opportunities to do that to really get at this design thinking unmet need piece even more directly and in a more targeted way, not just through the physician community, which is important, but also through the patient community.
I love how you mentioned like the value that we bring to the patients. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more. I had a family that I interviewed a while back, and their daughter has Rett syndrome. And they said that I think it was a week after she started her medication, she kissed her parents for the first time. And that was an endpoint that would totally be missed if it was just a survey, right? Nobody would have on the list, did your child kiss you? But for them, that was huge value. That was incredibly meaningful. So how are there ways that you've kind of throughout the life cycle of clinical trials really made sure that that value is being considered?
I mean, I'm happy to start and then turn it over. But I mean, look, first and foremost, we're probably never going to be able to quantify and measure all of those types of moments, right? Someone being able to attend, a wedding. And we hear about this, and I'm sure others do too, through patient testimonials where things that you never anticipated, right? I mean, someone, survives long enough or is healthy enough to, be part of a family reunion or see the birth of a grandchild or hold their child or say something or communicate something, which I think as human beings, again, getting back to human beings, I mean, is like the reason to do this type of work, right? And it's very hard to enter that into a cost effectiveness model. I mean, I think, it's just very hard to do that. I mean, certainly there are there's real tangible value to that. It's very hard to quantify. I think for me, the most important North Star is around making sure that all the patients who can benefit from a new therapy that's in development are able to access that development program. So there are lots of, looking at effect modification and quantifying, differential effects. But at the end of the day, and that's critical, but at the end of the day, it may be the difference if something's in a clinical program and it's going to take a year and a half to get to market. That year and a half is where these types of moments can either happen or not happen, right? I mean, these are people who in many cases may progress or die waiting in that period of time. So there is an urgency. And I think that urgency, we look at very long time horizons sometimes in industry, but for someone who has ALS or someone who has, metastatic ovarian cancer, they don't have the luxury of waiting for something to be commercialized, right? They want to be in a program now. And if you can't get access to a clinical program for whatever logistical reason, whether it's a skepticism of research, as Nicole mentioned, or whether it's a structural or functional reason or a social determinant of health reason, you're missing the opportunity to have those moments where something transformative can happen, like somebody can walk their daughter or son down the aisle, those kinds of moments. So anyway, I think for all the talk about, quantifying differential effects, which are important, I think at the end of the day, the North Star for me is, everybody should be able to tap into what could be a life-extending, life-changing, life-altering therapy while it's still in clinical development. Everybody who is potentially eligible for that program. And that's, I think, the North Star.
Nicole and Amanda, would either of you like to continue on that?
So very happy to just tag on very briefly to Ryan's last sentiment and then turn it over to you, Nicole. And I agree. Obviously, as I had noted within my team, very operationally focused in terms of identifying the patients, but also supporting them for that true breakdown in terms of what we know to be lack of access. So another considerable area of focus for our team, just thinking of that real world application once more, is that we've now taken all things patient travel and reimbursement on. Sounds so basic, but when we think about lack of access, one of the key areas as we think about social determinants of health and elements to the like is just how do we make this work financially? How do we make this work logistically? So again, it is such a basic component, but one that we need to address and address head on so that we can truly break down that barrier to truly allow that, again, opportunity for participation if clinically appropriate. So such things as allowing for our cost neutral participation to truly be able to remove, again, when we have limited insurance or no insurance, so those types of components. But how do we get a patient to and from? How do we address those mobility challenges or other areas to the like? So again, just really honing in on the very basic functionality that has to be addressed to really allow for that true breakdown of lack of access in terms of how we can make this a cost neutral situation and how we can ensure that logistically we are addressing all these key concerns that at the end of the day may be that decision point of whether I can participate or not. How do I manage this if I can't take time off work, if I can't get, as it's going to take 3 city buses for me to get to these locations? So again, just wanted to highlight that that's a real world application and something that my team is focusing on quite heavily so that we can make this as accessible as possible. But again, Nicole, please let me allow to turn it over to you.
No, these are all great points. And I would just say, I mean, philosophically, obviously, I think I agree with everything Ryan is saying. This is the reason I think many of us choose to work in the industries that we do. Many of us could do lots of things, but we choose to do this. And I think that we, in the day-to-day, sometimes the true tether can get lost, but it's really critical to keep bringing that back into everything that we're doing. As an example, and I think in just building on what Amanda said, really leaning into understanding the barriers was something we did early on. And I've been doing this work for about 7 years, almost 8 years now. And it does seem really straightforward, right? It seems really obvious. Like Amanda said, we should make sure it's cost neutral. Years ago, we weren't doing that, right? And we were looking into understanding how to better reach patients. And we were looking at catchment areas and how, what the demographics of a certain area were. And we started to see that sometimes it mattered and sometimes it didn't. And then we looked further to understand why. And it was often because of the reasons Amanda mentioned. Sometimes there are physicians and sites that just have a better process in place to make sure that there are food vouchers, there's childcare opportunities, um, there's reimbursement for parking before you park. You don't have to pay. There's travel opportunities. So really, in a lupus study, we were looking between these sites and seeing this one site was just really great at getting more patients enrolled across different patient backgrounds and subsets. And it was because they had a car that they used that staff went and actually physically picked up the patients that were in need. Now, that's not, feasible for everyone all the time, but making sure there's also an understanding of that when we select our partners, our investigators and physicians in this space. I think the difference that we can bring is by making sure our healthcare professionals are also thinking about these things. And some of them do very deeply, and some of them maybe don't as much. Even reaching all the way back into how we train physicians. So we've done work to trying to embed different types of training and programming in medical education, I think is really important, because we have to be thinking differently about how we partner with patients instead of, again, it's not a one-way interaction. It's a partnership in any setting when you're receiving healthcare. So I think all of these aspects become incredibly critical and come back to we're one piece, pharma industry is one piece of this much bigger puzzle. And until we have all those pieces in place, we won't be able to have transformative change.
Thank you. We are actually going to be wrapping up here soon before we go into the Q&A. But Ryan, I did want to bring this back to you to talk about, you'd mentioned how important real world evidence is. Can you please speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. No, and I think we touched on it a little bit, but what my team also thinks a lot about is as much as we need the things that Nicole and Amanda have spoken about, as much as we need to create a better framework for trials, for our experiments, essentially for our clinical research that's happening to form the sort of pivotal approval package for the drugs. There's, as I mentioned, right, there's never going to be enough evidence at that stage to answer all the questions that we need. And also, I will say, to support, which I think we're getting to a larger issue, which is to support continued access across, because we're talking about the trial, but then we're talking about a lot of other elements that are sort of part of a bigger, broader framework, right? Do patients, for instance, let's say we create an ovarian cancer therapy like we have here at AbbVie, right, that may require a specific biomarker to be tested. Do we know that in the real world, that biomarker is going to be tested amongst the various patients that may actually be able to benefit from that treatment? And so, we need to continue, right? Even if we do a great job of showing in the trial that there's benefit across multiple different groups, let's say in this case, African-American patients with ovarian cancer, once the drug is approved, do we know that they're going to actually get the testing required in order to initiate that treatment? And we know, right, testing, precision medicine, biomarker testing, it's not necessarily universally accessible, and it's not necessarily consistently applied across all of the patient groups that we think can benefit from the drug. So, we need to think about, once this product or program is released into the real world amongst all the pressures of real world normal clinical care, pricing, access, various levels of physician understanding, all the things that were mentioned, how do we make sure that not only all the great work that was done to ensure inclusion within the trial, how do we make sure that's borne out in how the drug is actually being used to impact public health? And that goes for both the effectiveness and the ability for patients to access the drug, as well as safety, because a lot of questions we just are not going to understand in clinical trials, and certain patients might not benefit in the real world. They might not benefit because of a prior treatment, because of a functional or even genetic reason, a metabolic reason. So anyway, I think, we're talking about this larger continuum. We're talking about social barriers. We're talking about, and I think we can't view that outside of the broader real world context of how are these drugs, and programs systemically being administered, and how do we continue to actively assess whether or not patients are benefiting across all these different dimensions in the real world. So thanks.
Awesome. And Nicole, I know you're going to do kind of our call to action here, but I'm going to ask you to do that at the end after we do our Q&As. And we've got actually a lot of good questions in here. If anybody has other ones, you can still type them in the chat, in the Q&A box, and I'll be able to see them. But we'll get through as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. All right, so the first was from Maria. She said, can you share any recommendations on how to drive inclusive trials under the current political environment, especially when interacting with patients and sites that may be hesitant to participate? Then I'll leave this open to anybody who wants to answer.
I can start and then welcome other perspectives. This is certainly something that needs to be addressed. So thinking about how we do that, and my team, what we're really focused on is embedding the discipline of population science, so understanding how medicines work across different patient populations related to biology, genetics, as well as investing in infrastructure in the external environment are two really key components. The first is the way we get through, I think, the current environment. Everything we're doing is data driven. It's focused. It's well known that disease outcomes and clinical response can vary dramatically across patients' race, ethnicity, and genetic ancestry. That's very well established. So what we're talking about is at its core a scientific endeavor to make sure patients representative of those who bear the burden of disease are reflected in clinical research. I think grounding in the science and making sure we're using a data-driven process is how we navigate the current environment. We have to move beyond these kind of concerns of there being triggers or topics that will be viewed as at odds with the current administration and some of the things that are happening, and just come back to the core of this is good science. When you record a patient's demographic information, it's standard medical practice, it's good clinical practice, and it's captured in harmonization guidelines. So I think we just have to root ourselves in good clinical practice and data-driven practices that will enable us to continue to reach patients. That's not to say it's not going to continue to be a challenge, but there's an educational component that we need to bring back at the heart of this issue and really ground in the science. It's a necessity for us to have this information and to make sure patients are truly reflective in our clinical research and evidence generation.
And then Melody, if I can just add briefly on top of that, and 100% agree with all that Nicole said, but if we're thinking about then that real world application once more, is that we as the pharmaceutical organizations also have to provide that support. So the educational is key. And I 100% agree, this is good science. We always need to route this back into the data, but then let's ensure that we're providing the support necessary that obviously allows for that patient to be identified, to participate, and again, full continuum.
All right, so Lila, I think it's Lila, I hope I pronounced your name right, has a question related to trust. She mentioned how trial sponsors need to be participating in these communities before, during, and after trials. So what are your companies doing to engage in these communities in a non-transactional and long-standing way?
So I suppose I can begin and then definitely turn it over. So I know, Lila, we spoke to this to some extent in my comments from earlier, but you're absolutely right. We do need to move away from the transactional approach, which is historically how pharmaceutical companies have worked with many of these communities, to these long-term relationships. And again, I think it's twofold. There is the reality of needing to show up. So we need to be in community. So it's not just good enough to say this is what we want to do, but we have to show up. We have to have that presence day in and day out. We do need to start these conversations very very early. So before we have that clinical trial where we are actively looking for patients, let's really broach these conversations very early on. Let's bridge that gap in terms of their lack of awareness around clinical research so that they can understand and have that comfort level that we can showcase our commitment to these communities early on, and to some of the points that Ryan heard before, to really understand what are these unmet medical needs, what are these greatest challenge barriers, so that we can obviously weave those into the reality of how we are putting forth our clinical development plans and ultimately putting forth our clinical trial designs. But then the other point, Lila, that you mentioned that I feel is critically important is that once that clinical trial completes, we don't disappear. That we continue to engage with these communities. We continue to obviously receive feedback, that we continue to bring our updates back to this community so they understand how elements are progressing from a clinical development cycle, and then how we can support them in those gaps or those interims between those key milestones. So again, just a few thoughts that I'd like to share on that topic.
Anyone else want to respond to that one? We good? All right. I'm going to move forward then. Actually, there was an observation from Diane. I think that's how you say his name. Again, I'm going to really hurt these names today, but he said it's good to finally hear all of you talking about how to work with communities, how to better engage with patients and people. So refreshing. So I just wanted to make sure we popped that in there. All right, let me see here. I'm going to actually jump down to the end a little bit. So what is your experience or perspective with direct-to-patient clinical trials as an option to reaching more diverse patient populations going beyond the reach of brick and mortar catchment areas? And this question's from Alan.
Yeah,
I can,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Ryan.
No, please, Nicole, go ahead.
I agree. I think that's a fantastic point. And as we think about just emerging trends in how we're conducting clinical trials and pragmatic trials, in different innovative and I actually expected models of reaching patients. I think that's a fantastic point. I think probably all of us are on this precipice in partnering with regulatory agencies and cross industry to better define how we can do trials differently, how we can reach patients differently. And I think that will not only support historically, understudied populations, but all patients.
Yeah, and I mean, just adding, I agree with that. I think, the big barriers to overcome are really around logistics and also around ensuring that we can still achieve the same level of scientific rigor with, when you make something more pragmatic, you lose a bit of your control over the chaos, if you will, right? And so, you're bringing kind of noise into the system. And the old framework, right, used to be you conduct a very restricted study to answer the question of, can this drug work? And then you broaden it out into the real world, right, in the post-marketing space to say, now does it work in the big broader context? I think what we're seeing, and I think to this point, is those barriers are being broken down for a number of reasons. And there's a lot of momentum to want to remove some of the barrier between the experimental setting and the broader sort of context setting. And those are in many ways coming from payer pressure, right? I mean, understanding something that may work under very experimental conditions where you maximize adherence and persistence and you keep the population very homogeneous, right? All these inclusion-exclusion criteria, which are there to accomplish a similar thing, which is to reduce, extraneous variables, noise in the system, right? To make sure that you're really able to detect something if it's real. And look, nobody wants to say a drug doesn't work when it really does. And so I get the tension there, right? We don't want to make a mistake. And so I think we have to do a couple things. I love the idea of, trying to be more pragmatic in creating that infrastructure, right? People will say, like, I don't know what the statistic is, but everybody lives within, I don't know, 5 miles of a Walgreens or CVS in the US or something incredible like that. That's almost kind of hard to imagine. And maybe we should start doing it at Starbucks, because I think there's probably even maybe within half a mile of everybody. But I think that working on those logistical factors is very important, and I think at the same time we have to really focus on creating, thinking about how to bring in pragmatic precision medicine approaches, so that even in the face of some more noise in the system, our drugs are beneficial enough and transformative enough that the signal to noise ratio is still positive. That's the way to overcome, I think, some of the concerns, right, about relaxing some of our inclusion-exclusion criteria and relaxing some of our tight restriction around these need to be centers of excellence performing clinical trials. So you bring something truly transformative into that overcomes a lot of problems with regard to noise and not being able to detect a difference. So anyway, it was a long answer to the question, but I think it's great. I think that there are headwinds on both sides, logistical reasons why it's still a bit challenging, but I think it's certainly something that we should be investing in and thinking about how to do, and at the same time making sure that our interventions are truly transformative.
All right, I have a question that I'm not sure that the three of you have expertise in, but I'm curious if you have any perspectives on it. Tina asked, how do we encourage biopharma to push a trial forward for even the most ultra rare diseases with the concept of N of 1? Can anyone speak to that? If you can't, that's also okay.
Well, I mean, I'll just comment broadly. I think that there's also a lot of opportunity for N of 1, very, ultra rare conditions to be sort of addressed through, academic medicine as well, I would say. I mean, I think, there's always, right, a need to think about how can the investments that are being made benefit patients, in the most important ways that are going to address patient needs and public health, right? So I think it's just a matter of, creating the awareness and the shared incentive to do that. I think, and also I would say, uh, bringing awareness and bringing, the discovery piece around ultra rare N of 1 types of conditions. I think, it may be that, but we also encourage, academic. I know academic medicine is also facing its own major challenges right now with the current administration. But I think, also, thinking about that as a discovery process and how do we encourage discovery. It could be that there already are drugs or interventions that could be useful for some of those conditions, and we're just not aware, right? Because they're so incredibly rare. But that's just a thought. But I welcome others to comment.
There are so many good questions in here. I would love if we could get to all of them, but we are running short on time, and I do want to make sure that we can kind of have a wrap up here. So we're going to actually end with Nicole, but Amanda, could you start with just kind of giving a summary of what you took away from today?
Absolutely. Phenomenal conversation. And what I took away from this, obviously, is the importance of infusing the patient voice in every step of the clinical trial continuum, but more so that real world application, as I've said many a times, that we need to be present in these communities. We need to be present from the onset. We need to show true commitment and investment in what we now can bring to them and how we can best serve them. And much of that is really continuing to identify ways that we very practically can break down these barriers as it relates to lack of awareness, lack of trust, lack of access, as we've discussed. So again, just acknowledging that I think much has been done as of late, but there's still so much more that we can do, and something that each of us can truly invest in as not only supporting the broader patient community, but as Ryan had said very earlier on, that we're all patients in our own rights and in terms of our family members as well. So again, just really trying to bridge that gap of sorts and do everything we can to be present in community and to break down these barriers each and every day.
All right, and Ryan, what did you take away from this today?
A whole lot. So I know we have about a minute left, so it's going to be hard to summarize. But I mean, I learned so much from hearing Nicole and Amanda speak, and I think I'll just go back to as a human, as a parent, it really makes me feel like we're headed in the right direction when it comes to thinking about how we can really ensure that everyone is carried along the journey of innovation, which, I mean, we all are here because we believe that we as humans do this incredible thing, which is we create these drugs that actually do more good than harm in human beings? And how do we make sure that we get them to people who can benefit and we enrich their lives and we provide some of those moments, Melody, that you mentioned, right, where people can have an experience, a human experience that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to have or experience in the same way, right? So yeah, I really appreciate what Nicole and Amanda are doing, and thank you as well for creating a better future for I think all of us probably down the road.
Thank you. All right, Nicole, you got like 30 seconds. Give us this call to action. What should our attendees take away from this?
Yes, thank you so much. And again, all of my gratitude to panelists and for the discussion. I would just leave us with, as leaders across pharma, from whatever role or function you sit in, our asks of you is that we move beyond this singular conversation and discussion and take true action to ensure the patient voice and that we're considering all patients as part of our clinical research and development process so that the medical advances we develop can truly benefit all patients.
Wonderful. All right. So we are at time. The questions that we didn't get to will be sent to attendees, so you might get an answer to them after in kind of the summary. But thank you for attending, and we are all set for today. Bye, guys.